and I'll open up Curse Voice. You guys can call in and give me your thoughts when we're done. When I get to the end of my spiel. So, healing in Smite. I'm talking about lifesteal. I'm talking about stuff like Bologna's 3. I'm talking about Sylvanas' 2, or Ra, or Hell. Um, Basically everything but HP 5 from. And all HP 5 sources, I think, are fine. Like, Funeral Rites is okay. Which is Isis' passive. Sovereignty is okay. Traveler Shoes are okay, excuse me. Even Stone of Guy, I think, are fine. But healing outside of that, I think, is fundamentally broken in Smite. Because, and don't get me wrong, I know you've seen this happen. Let's say there's an Ur in middle lane. You're Poseidon, and you ult him, but you get his beads, and he jumps out. Now you crack and hit, but it didn't stun him, so he was able to jump away before your tidal surge hit, right? Um, and you knock him down to 20% health, but you don't kill him. What sucks is he could walk into the jungle, find back harpies, let's say, probably not even that far, maybe in the next wave, and he can lifesteal all the way back to full, right? That's kind of fucked up because you just used something huge. You just reduced him to a very small amount of his health, and he could just heal to full immediately. Or in the dual lane, you poke somebody, they've got Devo Gauntlets or whatever, they got Aussie, they heal up really quickly. I think Aussie balances it a little bit nicer, but Devo Gauntlets, man, you still heal so quickly. Or when there's a Ra or a Hell and a Chunga in the game, right? Like, part of the reason why those characters have such weak early games and why every player, or almost every player, almost every level, will focus the shit out of a Hell, a Chunga, an Afro, a Ra in a game is because healing is so strong. Because between fights, in fight healing is balanced, right? You've got Weakening Curse, you've got Divine Rune, you've got Pestilence, Beat Stick. There's so many ways to counter it. But between fights, man, when they just back off and they heal in a Ra heal, there's very little you can do. I think that's fucking broken. I think if you were to reduce the capability of healing between fights, so you poke someone down, they have to hold that a little bit more, not entirely, so healing is still a thing. I think then you could balance healers in their early game, make it a little bit stronger, so we could actually see Hell, Chunga, Aphrodite, Ra, right? So we could actually like see them be allowed to be played because right now their early game's just a little bit too weak. Ra is obviously the exception; his early game's a little stronger, still the weak side, but a little bit stronger. But anyway, you could balance them to the point where they're playable. Right now, Chunga, Hell, they're not playable, right? Their early game is too weak. They get camped out, and the reason that they're balanced like that is because their late game is too strong. How do you fix their late game? I think you fix healing between fights. In fights, it's balanced. Weakening Curse, Divine Rune, etc. There's plenty of countermeasure, but between fights, there's no countermeasure. Here's my proposition: if you've played Bloodline Champions or Pillars of Eternity, you've seen a system like this, or Ninja Gaiden 2 had it well as well. Basically, permanent damage and semi-permanent damage, right? Now, in Ninja Gaiden 2 and in Pillars of Eternity, the way this works is you get into a fight, you take damage, and at the end of the fight it heals up, but there's still some sort of lasting damage on your character. In Pillars of Eternity, it's health and endurance. Endurance is in combat. You have 50 endurance and 200 health. So you take 40 endurance damage, you're nearly knocked out. If they did 10 more damage, you would be knocked out. The fight ends, you heal to full, but you have to hold the health damage. If you get healed in a fight, your endurance refreshes, your health doesn't, right? So over the course of multiple fights, you could be whittled down. In Ninja Gaiden, it was just something like 30% of damage you have to hold, 70% of damage can get healed up. Another example, Marvel vs. Capcom does this, right? When one of your characters in the back, they've taken some damage, but it can heal up a little bit, right? Um, yeah, so fighting games do this as well. I think that would be really fucking cool. So that way, right, let's go back to the original example. I'm Poseidon. I crack an Ur. I get his beads, but he jumps out. He doesn't die. When he goes to lifesteal, since I've dropped him to 20% health, he can't get back to full. He could get back to, say, 70% of his health. I think that's fine, right? Because they're healing up. Lifesteal's still good. Raw and Hell still good. You're still able to sustain people between fights. You're still able to whittle people down. But you cannot sustain forever. Which is something that Raw, Chunga, Hell can do. Yeah, like a black bar over their health, or a darker red, or whatever, right? So that way, in lane, you could poke someone repeatedly, whittle them down, and eventually they get to the point where their maximum health has been reduced to 60%. So the question then becomes, how does this get removed? Two ways. One, go into the fountain. Fountain heals through it, you heal to full. Two, HP 5. I propose that also, if you're at full health, your HP 5, including auras from Sovereignty, Traveler's Shoes, Isis's Funerals, your HP 5 ticks away at the permanent damage. So, Uller taking a shit ton of damage. He heals himself as much as he can, up to 70%, but the remaining last 30% of health is like blocked away. Well, now his HP 5, with 25 extra from standing next to his support with Sovereignty, is going to start taking that back up. It's going to take a long time, but he'd eventually get to full if he stayed, uh, healthy. If he goes back to base, damage is removed, he can heal to full. What you could also do is you can change anti-healing items a little bit. You could have something like Divine Ruin, where instead of reducing healing output, it becomes output that your opponents have to hold, right? So 100% of that damage becomes unhealable. Weakening Curse maybe, or 40% of the damage becomes unhealable, as opposed to the regular 20%, right? So let's go back to the first example, right? Like Poseidon Krakens the Uller, he beads and jumps out. Without Divine Ruin, Uller could only heal up to 70% of his health from 20. With Divine Ruin, he could only heal up to 60% of his health. I think that would be cool. I think that would create like a nice little ability of balance. Now, would this nerf healers? Yeah, it would nerf Hell, Ra, Chang'e, Guan, and they're already weak characters. Now, Sylvanas, he's strong as fuck, but whatever. They're already weak characters. So now you buff them. So now you say, okay, well, Chang'e's early game is kind of shit. Let's increase her clear a little bit. Okay, well, Hell's early game is kind of shit. Why? Well, she's really gankable, so I don't know, let's increase the clear on her 1 or give her higher base stats or something, right? Like, what about pots? You'd probably want pots to be in the same category as lifesteal. If pots ticked away max health, you just see a late game meta where everyone would be running health pots and multi pots. And so you get poked down, heal up, and then health pot, multi pot, and just tick, 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 tick. Because health pot, multi pot at the same time is 15 health per second. So that's what, 90 health per 5? It's crazy. It's a lot. Um, yeah. So do you guys have. Would you buff base HP 5? No. Would you buff the early base healing of the mages? Yeah, maybe. Um, you could probably do the same thing for minions too, honestly, right? Like, that way you wouldn't have Ra having infinite sustained minion push, which is kind of silly. It's not something that happens too much, but it's kind of silly and could be a problem if you buff the base healing of mages, right? Like, so then you could have Chang'e, a conceivable buff to her would be to take her 3 and double the healing, because this is really shit. Yeah, I mean, and really, so Mike mentioning this, and if anyone wants to talk, just let me know. We can, set up Curse Voice or something and talk. If anyone wants to, but yeah, no. So anyway, like characters like Hell can't be allowed to get to late game because their kits are inherently stupid. If they do, it requires an entire game design change. If it works with something like meditation. Meditation would be the same as any other heal. Um, you could maybe make Salvation increase HP 5 for duration, so Salvation would tick away at that. It could be cool, or have an active that does that, or whatever. Um, yeah. So yeah, Hell cannot be allowed to get to late game, right? Because if Hell isn't feeding, if she is allowed to play, you have her spinning out 25% movement speed for 6 seconds every 6 seconds. Healing people for God knows now how much. It's 180 plus 50%, up to 20% bonus from her passive. So 400 every 6 seconds. And cleansing people nonstop every 6 seconds for 1.3 seconds, right? Like, Hell cannot be allowed to be played right now. How would Wukong and Vimana fare with that change? They might have some trouble with their ultimates, but you could change that. You could mess with their ultimates too. You could rebalance them a little bit. Right? Like, it is an idea that would require a lot of balancing and rebalancing, but I think it is an inherently better system than the current way where it just sort of is like, well, poke someone, but it doesn't do anything. Now, what could potential downsides be? Poke and lane could probably become very, very strong. Um, so maybe it's something, maybe it's a stat that is increased as you level up, right? Maybe it's a stat that every character has and it's different. So you could balance it that way, right? Call it trauma. Each character has a different trauma number. Now you could do it two different ways. Maybe trauma number is the amount of permanent damage they take, or maybe it's the amount of permanent damage they deal. There could be two different ways to balance it, right? So you could have in one system you have a character like Vamana, which would have a very high amount of trauma, which would then mean that when you deal, or Hercules, which would mean that when you do deal damage to him, a very small percent of it would be permanent. Or you could do it the other way where you say, all right, well, a character like Isis or a character like Agni who's really good poke would have an inherently very low amount of trauma. So that way, he can poke you, he could get you low, but you could heal back up a little bit to counter it. And then, oh yeah, so resilience defensively to trauma aggressively, like whatever, right? So Agni would have a very low amount of trauma, but you could buy items to increase it. That way you could make it so that Agni's poke actually sticks with people, or you could have you could just keep it really low. A character like Poseidon that dumps his kit but that doesn't have that much left and doesn't really poke. Like Poseidon doesn't really poke, should have very high trauma, so the damage that he is hitting sticks to people. Something like that. What about items and actives to cleanse the trauma? Yeah, actives could certainly do it. Something like Heavenly Agility could, or Shell could increase resilience for a time, so the damage you take during Shell and Heavenly Agility is less permanent. You could have Salvation, which could apply like an HP 5 tick to tick away the traumatic damage. Um, there are a lot of things you could do, but I think it would just be a stronger system for managing player health bars, dealing with poke, and balancing healers because it there's two sorts of systems that you can add into a game. There's well when you're complexifying a game, right? There's two sorts of systems. There's one where there's sorts of systems that make the game harder to balance. For example, Sylvanas' support made the game harder to balance because how do you buff Guardians without breaking Sylvanas? Ymir does that too. Or you can add systems that can fluxify a game but make it easier to balance by giving you more wrenches, more things to adjust. Uh, yeah. So, yeah, Mike, what were you saying? It's too foolproof. Yeah, so maybe it's like it's too much of an idea to be put in at once. I think it's definitely the sort of thing that would have to go in between seasons, but I think it could be really interesting because I feel like healing in Smite has been really broken for a really long time. So Mike is saying if you dump this change between seasons, which is the only option